Does an English tax really exist? Well, not if you are Prince Charles, now King Charles III of course, who just avoided paying £150 million of inheritance tax on a £370 million fortune due to a royal exemption. But it's not that type of tax that I'm referring to, partly because that might get me arrested. Any of you who have spent 5 minutes exploring the deepest, darkest waters of football Twitter, and I'm sure most other social media sites, which I suspect is most of you, will most likely be familiar with the phrase English tax. It is a term which is used to describe the perception that English footballers command inflated transfer fees for no other reason than the fact that they are English. It's a suggestion that has been floating around for at least a decade. I can remember people making that point when Manchester City paid £22 million to sign Joleon Lescott in 2009, and when Liverpool forked out around £20 million each to sign Stuart Downing and Jordan Henderson in 2011. The latter of whom, incidentally, turned out to be an absolute bargain. But it was in 2019, with the £80 million move of Harry Maguire from Leicester City to Manchester United, that I really started to see the term English tax being bandied about, and an almost universal acceptance that it reflected a very real phenomenon, an idea that has been strengthened by the transfers of Ben Chilwell, Ryan Brewster, Jack Grealish, Jadon Sancho, Ben White, and many others since then. Now you get lots of memes on Twitter with stuff like a photo of Calvin Phillips, with an England flag, being valued at £45 million, and then the same photograph but with a silly moustache drawn on it, the name changed to Calvin Filippo with an Italian flag, and they'll be valued at £5 million. I see these all the time on Twitter and Facebook, but I couldn't actually find any for the purpose of this video since it is quite difficult to know what to search for to find that kind of meme. Hence why I ended up making my own. The closest that I could get was something like this, which was from the Troll Football Twitter account, but you get the general idea. On the face of it, it seems to make sense. There are an awful lot of English players who have transferred for extortionate fees, not all of them have proved to be outstanding value for money, and there is a general consensus, especially outside of England, that English players are overhyped, overvalued, and aren't actually as good as a lot of people like to make out. But is any of it actually true? For starters, do English players actually transfer for larger fees than players from any other country? If so, is that just because they are English? And if the answer to both of those questions is yes, then why on earth is that the case? These are questions that I keep getting asked, so I thought I'd make a video attempting to answer them all, and, well, that is what this is. Enjoy. The first point to address, I suppose, is whether English players actually transfer for bigger fees than their Italian, Brazilian, German, or South Korean counterparts. If we take a look at the 10 most expensive transfers of all time, and indeed the 15 most expensive in fact, despite 10 English clubs being involved in those transactions, only one of those players, Jack Grealish, is actually English. Grealish's 2021 move from Aston Villa to Manchester City for £100 million makes him the 6th most expensive player of all time. But following that, you have to go to Harry Maguire in 16th at £80 million, and then Jadon Sancho in 18th at £73 million. That is it in terms of English men, who rank among the 50, yes, 50, most expensive transfers of all time, despite England having consistently been one of the highest ranked national teams on the planet over the last 10 to 15 years, and being home to the richest league in world football throughout that same period as well. By comparison, there are 9 Frenchmen among those top 50 transfers, 5 Brazilians, and 5 Spaniards. Even Portugal, a country of just 10 million people, which isn't home to one of Europe's top 5 leagues, has 2 transfers in the top 10 and 4 in the top 50. And Belgium, which has fewer than 12 million inhabitants and a top flight which doesn't even feature among Europe's top 10 by UEFA coefficient rankings, has 5 transfers in the top 50, albeit 3 of them are Romelu Lukaku. Among the most expensive transfers then, at the elite level, for fees of £55 million or more, not only is there no suggestion of a so-called English tax, English players are actually statistically underrepresented, given their probable worth, based upon almost any metric used to gauge player value. That, I think, is partly explained by the fact that many of the most valuable English footballers are already at top clubs, and have been for a long time, and they either don't want to leave or their clubs refuse to sell them. Harry Kane, for example, would almost certainly be among the top 10 most expensive transfers were it not for the fact that Tottenham dug in their heels and Daniel Levy refused to sell him amid multiple bids from Manchester City. The likes of Phil Foden, Bukayo Saka, Reece James, Trent Alexander-Arnold, Mason Mount and Marcus Rashford are all worth an absolute fortune, but are all also still contracted to the super clubs, whose academies they came through. Meanwhile, Declan Rice might not be at a super club, with all due respect to West Ham, but his valuation by the Hammers, and the fact that he hasn't kicked up an enormous fuss about leaving, means that he hasn't yet transferred for a stupendous fee. Of all of the players that I've mentioned, Rice is the most likely to be bought and sold for a massive fee at some stage, but Foden and co could quite easily stick around at their current clubs for the foreseeable future, either retiring there or departing in their late 20s or 30s, by which stage their value will have significantly diminished. Even when we drop down below that, to players in the £25 to £50 million bracket, there isn't actually an overrepresentation of English players, which, I must admit, did surprise me a little, but just because there isn't an overrepresentation doesn't mean that those players aren't still overvalued. You could argue, for instance, that although there are only 3 English players among the top 50 most expensive transfers, that Jack Grealish, Harry Maguire and Jadon Sancho all commanded an English tax and were therefore overpriced. In fact, I suspect that a great many people would make just that claim. None of those 3 have exactly proven to be bargains yet, albeit Grealish and Sancho have only spent a single season at their current clubs. Maguire, with the benefit of hindsight, certainly seems extortionate now, and many will say that he always did, but the consensus on that one has actually shifted a fair bit over time. Sancho, when he was signed, based upon his age and the numbers that he had put up consistently over a number of years at Borussia Dortmund, I actually thought seemed pretty cheap. Though, he is yet to produce the kind of form in the Premier League that he did in the Bundesliga. I did personally always think that £100 million seemed a little bit on the steep side for Jack Grealish, despite believing that he is a lot better than some people give him credit for. And his signing is one that we will circle back round to a little bit later on, as I think it is the most interesting out of the 3. Even if we conceded, though, that yes, all 3 were a total rip-off and terrible value for money, were they any more overpriced than the majority of mega deals in their price bracket? Was Jadon Sancho, for example, a worse signing than Nicola Pepe, who commanded an almost identical price tag? Was Jack Grealish a worse signing for £100 million than Romelu Lukaku was at £97.5 million, Antoine Griezmann at £107 million, or Philippe Coutinho at between £105 to £142 million? Harry Maguire is the only one out of the 3 where there hasn't been a comparable player who has transferred for a comparable fee, who has obviously been worse or at least on par with him, though that is primarily because Virgil van Dijk is the only other centre-back to have been transferred for in excess of £70 million. So far, no English tax, at least as far as I can make out. Where we do start to get some inflated transfer fees for English players, I think, is when it comes to more mediocre, or at the very least, non-elite players. I am thinking primarily of Danny Drinkwater for £35 million, Andy Carroll for £35 million, and maybe even Ross Barkley for £15 million. You will notice, however, that these are all also inter-Premier League transfers, and if we look at other transfers between Premier League teams, whether that be Marc Cucurella recently going from Brighton to Chelsea, Richarlison's move from Everton to Tottenham, or Gylfi Sigurdsson's transfer from Swansea City to Everton, they all commanded a similar premium. It is far more accurate if you look at almost all of the available data to say that there is a Premier League tax, if you want to stick with that term, than it is to say there is an English tax, and that is very easy to explain. Premier League teams are filthy rich. I recently made a video entitled "Has the Premier League Broken the Transfer Market?", exploring the enormous gulf that now exists between the Premier League and every other football league on the planet in more depth. The revenue of the 20 Premier League teams, thanks primarily to the league's massive media rights deals, affords them a great deal of leverage within the transfer market. Whilst Barcelona might be used to bullying teams in La Liga into selling them their star men, when they came calling for Rafinha at Leeds United, they were forced to pay a premium. Bayern Munich have made a real habit of signing some of the best players from the best of the rest in the Bundesliga for peanuts, or even on frees, yet they failed in their pursuit of Callum Hudson-Odoi at Chelsea, who couldn't even get a game for the Blues at the time, and even when they came in for Norwich City fullback Max Aarons, the Canaries were able to hold firm. Incidentally, Barcelona also reportedly made an unsuccessful £20 million bid for Aarons. When a club like Norwich City demands £35 million for someone like Max Aarons, a lot of people will cry out English tax, or overrated, when in actual fact, it is just that Aarons is worth a lot of money to Norwich City, and they can afford to hold out for that amount, unlike clubs of a comparable size for comparable players in almost any other league. There was a time when Crystal Palace set an asking price for Wilfried Zaha of £80 million, and loads of people responded by saying, "Are you absolutely insane? No one's gonna pay that." Well, quite. That is the entire point. Crystal Palace don't want to sell Wilfried Zaha, especially not a few years ago when he accounted for about 90% of their entire creative and attacking spark. You might say that Zaha isn't worth £80 million, and that is probably true to anyone else. But if Premier League survival is worth somewhere in the region of £200 million, and Zaha secured that for Palace season after season, you can start to see how, if anything, he was worth a great deal more to them than even the £80 million that they demanded. I do think that, given that the data doesn't really back up the suggestion that English players are overpriced, that a lot of the English tax sentiment stems from the prices that are quoted for players, typically in the media, fed by various sources or sometimes just plucked out of thin air, even though very rarely do these players actually get transferred for the sums that are quoted. A great illustration of the fact that proven Premier League players command higher transfer fees, English or otherwise, is by looking at the transfer fees of English players signed from Championship clubs, which is far more comparable in terms of the amount of leverage that these clubs have, in most instances, especially when dealing with clubs who don't have parachute payments, to transfer dealings involving players from other leagues, regardless of their nationality. In the last few years alone, if you look at the transfer fees paid for the likes of Jared Bowen, Jude Bellingham, and Eberechi Eze, or even James Maddison and Joe Gomez, if you want to go back a little bit further than that, it is evident that there are bargains to be had. If Hull City had won promotion to the Premier League, and West Ham wanted to sign Jared Bowen, even if he hadn't yet produced the kind of form that he had done in the Championship in the Premier League, he would still have commanded a fee of at least £40 million, rather than the £18 to £25 million that he actually cost West Ham. Not because he would have somehow been more English if Hull City were a Premier League team, but because the Tigers would have had less of a reason to sell him, a greater incentive to keep hold of him, and a stronger hand in negotiations. One of the arguments that is most frequently made as to why people perceive that English players come with a certain tax or are overvalued is because they are overhyped by the English press, pundits, and various media figures. Now, I am not disputing that English pundits might be biased towards English players. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Personally, I think that there is some truth to it, but it can be a little bit overblown. But what I am absolutely certain of is that elite-level football clubs, with hordes of data analysts, scouts, heads of recruitment, directors of football, managers, chairmen, and all the rest of it, many of whom, if not most of whom now, aren't even English, I am certain that they are not convinced to sign someone because Gary Neville or Jamie Carragher says that they are the best thing since sliced bread on Monday Night Football. The only way in which the English press, which I am absolutely not defending, a more rancid, poisonous, malignant and dishonest institution you would do well to find, is likely to actually have any influence upon the value of English footballers is by increasing or decreasing their commercial appeal, either by making them more or less toxic, or simply by raising their profile. Manchester City did not pay £100 million to sign Jack Grealish because he is English, or because a load of pundits said that he's very good, but the fact that he is extremely marketable as an athlete and is an effective commercial tool, well, that might have factored into their thinking. I suspect that it was a very minor factor, dwarfed by footballing considerations, but nonetheless, it is feasible that it entered into their minds when weighing up the deal as a whole and the hefty price tag involved. Even still, I think the power that the media has when it comes to the marketability of professional footballers has been significantly diminished in recent years. Despite repeated attempts to smear Marcus Rashford, for example, in most of Britain's most widely circulated newspapers, he remains extremely popular with the wider public, and therefore very valuable to a club from a commercial perspective. If you want to look at genuine reasons why English players do sometimes command a certain premium in the transfer market, outside of the obvious reason, which is undoubtedly the leverage and revenue of Premier League teams, there is of course also the Premier League's homegrown player quota, which is often brought up and most people are well aware of, though often without knowing exactly how it works. Don't worry, anyone who happens to play Football Manager, I know that you are exempt from that. The homegrown player rule, which was introduced as part of the Premier League's Elite Player Performance Plan, dictates that no squad can register more than 17 non-homegrown players. That does mean that, technically, you could still have no homegrown players and just have a tiny squad of 17, but assuming that you have a full squad of 25, you would have to have at least 8 players who are homegrown. A homegrown player is defined as anyone who has spent 3 years contracted to an English club before the age of 21. So, it can include foreign players like Cesc Fabregas or Paul Pogba, but obviously tends to be English players who came through English academies, especially post-Brexit, in which new rules were introduced preventing English clubs from signing overseas players who are under the age of 18. If a team is struggling to meet their homegrown player quota, it is feasible, once again, that they might be willing to pay a certain premium for someone who could fill one of those slots, who is likely to be English. I don't think that it is an enormous problem for most clubs, and it is much easier to fill those spots with second or third choice goalkeepers than it is to fork out a club record fee on someone just because they are English. But again, it is a factor. There is also the fact that English players, if they do turn out to be absolute gems who become bona fide world-class superstars, are less likely to demand a move to a Real Madrid, Barcelona, Bayern Munich or PSG. To use the example of Rafinha once again, as a Brazilian, with the Brazilian history at that club, he viewed FC Barcelona as the be-all and end-all, and as his dream move, and therefore he had his heart set upon joining them. We saw similar situations play out with Felipe Coutinho and Luis Suarez with Barcelona, or Cristiano Ronaldo and Eden Hazard leaving Manchester United and Chelsea respectively to sign for Real Madrid. Of course, Real Madrid, Barcelona, Bayern Munich and PSG could all still make very attractive offers to English players. But typically, the English tend to be reluctant travellers who are more comfortable with their home comforts in the richest league in the world where they know how to speak the language and so on and so forth. It is a lot more complex than that, and I've also made an entire video about why so few English players travel abroad, but you get the general idea. And for clubs, having players who are more likely to stick around, that is another tiny little positive on the side of English players, as far as Premier League clubs are concerned. Much more significant, of course, is the fact that English players don't need time to acclimatise to English football, English culture, if you like, or learn the language, which means that there is a greater likelihood that they will be able to hit the ground running than someone who is signed from overseas. They also have already proven what they can do at this very level and in this league, removing the amount of risk on the club's part. In any investment, whether that is within or outside of football, less risk commands a greater premium. It is the reason why some of the best companies often have higher than average PE ratios within the stock market, and why safer United States government bonds are more attractive than, say, Turkish or Namibian government bonds to investors. In that instance, the premium means that US government bonds can afford to have a lower rate of return in the form of an interest rate, but anyway, I digress. It should be said, because this isn't a point that is made very often, that there are just lots of very valuable English footballers. If any other fullback had put up the kind of numbers that Trent Alexander-Arnold has done, at his age, from fullback, as one of the standout players in a team that has won it all, then they would command a hefty price tag, whether they were from China, Botswana, or Nicaragua. Harry Kane is, quite literally, one of the best players in the world. Phil Foden and Bukayo Saka are outstanding young players, as are the likes of Harvey Elliott and Jude Bellingham. According to the CIES Football Observatory, England have more players among the top 50, 100, and 150 most valuable footballers in the world than any other nation. That is not because they are English, obviously, but because of all of the factors that we have already discussed, and, most crucially of all, their age, how long they are under contract, and how good they are at football. So, to return to that Declan Rice meme just for a moment, which was shared by Troll Football on Twitter, albeit the very small watermark appears to suggest that it was created by someone called Chalaboy Comics, what to make of it? Well, aside from the fact that I am pretty sure the second photograph is problematic, this summer, the most expensive transfer in all of world football was a Brazilian, in the form of Antony. Manchester United also paid a reported £60 million, plus a further £10 million in future add-ons, for a Brazilian who plays in Declan Rice's position and is 30 years old. Meanwhile, Rice is only 23, in the form of Casemiro. Jorginho, who is Italian, set Chelsea back a potential £57 million, a fair few years ago now, which is more than all but a handful of English players have ever been transferred for, and Frankie de Jong, a Dutchman, is the most expensive deep-line midfielder of all time, having set Barcelona back some £65 million and being valued at £73 million by the Catalan giants this summer. In short, there is next to no evidence that an English tax exists. It is much more appropriate to say that there is a Premier League tax due to the leverage of Premier League teams, who obviously buy and sell a lot of English players. And if English tax does exist, at all, it is extremely marginal due to considerations such as the homegrown player quota and the slight edge, in some instances, when it comes to marketability. Well, I sure am glad that we cleared that one up, and I know that there will still be some people who aren't entirely satisfied with that conclusion. I must admit, my initial impression, when I decided to make this video and before doing any research, was that English players did command more of a premium than they have actually done, and that they tended to be rip-offs more often than foreign players, but there is just very little evidence or data to suggest that that is the case. So, yeah, as I so often say to my girlfriend, I am sorry to disappoint. As I also often say to her, why don't you subscribe to HITC Sevens? I'm almost at 500,000 subscribers now. She never listens, but hopefully you might. Thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed today's video, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on social media via the username at HITC Sevens on both Twitter and Instagram, should you wish to do so. Cheers.